She wired $500,000 into my account the same morning she told me she didn't believe in love, only leverage. That was Victoria Hale for you. My boss. My wife. My executioner. People called her the Ice Queen of Hale Industries, untouchable, perfect, terrifying. I called her mine, for a price. It started as a deal, 1 year, 1 contract, 1 signature. No love. No strings. Just business. But business turns personal when you start mistaking frost for purity. When you start believing the woman who buys your ring might actually wear her heart beneath all that ice. And me? I played along. I smiled for the cameras. Kissed her when the boardroom demanded affection. Until I learned the truth. You can buy loyalty. You can buy silence. But you can't buy me twice. When I met Victoria Hale, I was 3 months behind on rent, 1 eviction notice away from moving back into my car, and clinging to the last thread of my dignity. I used to design buildings, real ones. Not the kind that crumbles on paper because a client cuts the budget, but the kind that makes you stop and stare. My career was steady until a deal went south and took my reputation with it. So when Hale Industries posted an opening for a personal operations assistant, I swallowed my pride and applied. The first time I walked into her office, I felt small. Everything about Victoria was sharp, the lines of her glass desk, the click of her heels, the way her eyes measured every word before slicing it apart. She didn't smile when she shook my hand. "You're overqualified," she said flatly, scanning my resume. "I'm underemployed," I replied. Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. She liked honesty, even if it hurt. She hired me that afternoon. Working for Victoria was like orbiting the sun, brilliant from a distance, deadly up close. Her schedule ran like a war plan. Every minute was accounted for, every decision a calculated strike. But beneath that polished cruelty, I saw something else: exhaustion. Loneliness. The kind you hide behind power because power doesn't betray you. Our first few weeks were mechanical. I managed her meetings, drafted memos, watched her turn $1 million deals into signatures and smiles. But she had a way of making silence heavy. Even her thank yous were cold, like currency exchanged, not emotion offered. Still, I couldn't help admiring her. Late nights in her office, the city's lights painting the glass in gold, I'd watch her stare out at the skyline she practically owned. Her expression softened when she thought no one was looking. There was humanity in that stillness, something fragile she refused to admit existed. One evening, she called me into her office past midnight. The air smelled of whiskey and exhaustion. Her jacket was off, her hair slightly undone, the first time I'd ever seen her imperfect. "Ethan," she said, voice lower than usual. "I need you to do something for me. Something unconventional." I waited. She poured herself another drink but didn't offer me one. "I need you to marry me." The glass almost slipped from my hand. I thought she was joking, but Victoria Hale didn't do it. She set her drink down, meeting my stunned silence with complete calm. "My board is forcing me to present more domesticated image before the merger with Lexford Group. They want a married CEO, someone who represents stability. Optics." I tried to laugh it off. "You're saying you need a prop?" Her eyes narrowed. "I'm saying I need a husband. On paper. For 12 months. You'll be compensated." "How much?" She didn't blink. $500,000. I remember the hum of the city below us, the soft flicker of light off the whiskey in her glass. I remember every reason I should have said no, the imbalance, the absurdity, the danger of it. But when you've got nothing left to lose, $500,000 sounds a lot like salvation. "When do we start?" I asked quietly. "Tomorrow. Courthouse at 10. And that was it. No ring, no romance, no promises, just a signature and a transaction. The wedding was as sterile as the offer. She wore a white suit, I wore the same suit I used for interviews. No guests. No vows. Just 2 signatures and a legal binding that felt more like a contract than a commitment. Afterward, she handed me a black credit card. "You'll need to look the part," she said. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep emotions out of a business arrangement. But the truth was, Victoria Hale had a gravity to her. The more I tried to stay detached, the more she pulled me in. It started small. A smile when I made her laugh. The way she brushed my arm when passing me documents. Dinners where conversation slipped past business into memory, like the time she admitted she hadn't celebrated a birthday in years because they're distractions from productivity. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me, not the calculating stare I'd grown used to, but something softer, something questioning. I didn't know it then, but that was the first crack in her armor. And in mine. The first few weeks of marriage felt like working inside a museum, everything expensive, everything silent. Victoria's penthouse sat on the 40th floor, walls of glass looking out over the city. At night it glittered with reflections instead of warmth. We didn't share a bedroom. She had hers, I had the guest suite that looked like it had never been used. Breakfast was black coffee for her, burnt toast for me. We rarely spoke in the mornings. Still, the oddest thing happened, silence became routine, and routine became comfort. At work, I still called her Ms. Hale. She never corrected me. But at home, there were moments when the titles slipped. One night, while she was reviewing contracts at the kitchen island, I walked past her and said, "Long day." "Long week," she murmured without looking up. It wasn't much, but it was the first honest sentence we'd exchanged that didn't involve a schedule or a signature. Over time, she let me see fragments of the woman behind the marble. Late nights when the city was asleep, I'd find her standing by the window with a glass of wine, barefoot, hair loose, watching the streets below like she'd forgotten how to be part of them. "Don't you ever get tired of pretending you don't feel anything?" I asked once, half joking. She glanced at me, eyes unreadable. "It's easier to manage people when they can't read you." I wanted to ask who had made her that way, but the question stuck in my throat. Small gestures replaced conversation. She started leaving coffee for me in the mornings, no comment, just there. I began bringing her lunch during the long board meetings. She'd take it with a quiet nod. It felt almost real. Then the cracks appeared. Phone calls she'd step outside to take. Messages that made her expression tighten. Meetings added to her calendar that weren't in mine. When I asked, she'd say, "It's above your clearance, Ethan," like I was an employee again, not a husband. One afternoon her lawyer, a man named Dorsey, cornered me in the elevator. "Friendly advice," he said, pressing the button for the lobby. "Stay in your lane. Mrs. Hale values privacy." "She can tell me that herself," I replied. He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes she prefers not to repeat herself." After that, I started paying attention. She kept a second phone in her drawer. I heard her whisper once, something about moving assets before the merger finalizes. When she saw me in the doorway, she ended the call and smiled like nothing had happened. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I answered. "Try harder," she murmured, returning to her computer. The distance grew again, colder this time. Yet every time I thought about confronting her, she'd pull me back in with something disarmingly human. A week later, I came home from a late client dinner to find her asleep on the couch, documents scattered on the floor, the television still playing a muted news channel. I turned it off and covered her with a blanket. Her hand caught mine before I could pull away. Eyes half open, she whispered, "You shouldn't care this much, Ethan." "Someone should," I said. She didn't reply, just let go, drifting back to sleep. Moments like that kept me anchored, even as logic screamed that something wasn't right. Then came the night I overheard her. I was returning from studying when I heard her voice through the cracked office door. He's convenient. Polite enough for the cameras. He understands his role. A pause. Someone replied on speaker, muffled, probably Dorsey again. Victoria's tone hardened. Of course he's just a prop. That's what we paid for. The words hit like a physical blow. I stood there, frozen, the world suddenly too quiet. When I finally moved, the floor creaked. The conversation stopped. Seconds later, she opened the door. "Ethan," she said softly, as if testing the air. "You're still awake." I forced a smile. Couldn't sleep. Again. Her gaze searched mine, then slid away. "You work too much." "So do you." She closed the door without another word. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every touch, every smile. Each one felt manufactured now, pre-programmed to keep me compliant. But the next morning, she disarmed me again. She knocked on my door holding 2 coffees and a crooked smile. "Peace offering," she said. "For what?" "For being impossible to live with." Her tone was light, teasing, almost self-aware. Maybe she didn't mean what I'd heard. Maybe it was business talk, corporate detachment. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. We sat by the window as sunlight broke over the city. For a few minutes, it felt like we were just 2 tired people trying to keep their lives from collapsing. She told me about her father's company, how she'd inherited it when she was barely 25, how every man on the board had tried to control her. "They called me cold," she said, tracing the rim of her cup. "They didn't like that I didn't smile when they lied to me." "Maybe they just couldn't handle someone who didn't need them," I said. She looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw something unguarded in her expression. "Maybe," she whispered. That night, she invited me to a charity gala, our first public appearance as husband and wife. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. She took my arm, leaned close enough for the microphones to catch her laugh. "You're doing well," she murmured through her smile. "It feels like theater," I replied. "It is," she said. "And you're my leading man." I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt used. But when the night ended and we rode home in silence, she reached for my hand, briefly, almost unconsciously. Her fingers were cold. She didn't pull away. Maybe that was her apology. Maybe it was a strategy. I couldn't tell anymore. By the end of that first quarter, I was living 2 lives, the public husband smiling for investors, and the private employee walking on glass. Every red flag waved louder, but every quiet gesture from her kept me tethered. I started wondering which version of her was real, the ruthless executive who saw me as a means to an end, or the woman who fell asleep beside an untouched glass of wine, whispering things she'd never admit in daylight. Either way, I was already in too deep to walk away. And somewhere behind those walls of glass, I knew she was planning something I wasn't meant to see. It started with an email I wasn't supposed to see. Victoria had left her laptop open on the dining table, the screen still glowing. I'd gotten home late from a meeting she'd sent me to cover, one that, in hindsight, was meant to get me out of the building. The subject line read, "Merger Timeline plus Pre-Divorce Strategy." I wish I could say I didn't open it. That I respected her privacy. But by then, privacy was already a lie we'd been telling each other for months. The document was clinical, bullet points and projections. But buried halfway down, a section froze my blood. Post-merger dissolution plan. Initiate divorce proceedings Q3 to maintain narrative control. Justification, emotional incompatibility and professional instability on the spouse's part. Ensure documentation supports a pattern of verbal aggression, attorney drafting affidavits. Financial settlement already disbursed, see initial payment, $500,000. It felt like the floor vanished. Every gesture of kindness, every shared glance, all of it was choreography for this. I scrolled further, finding her lawyer's signature and a series of drafts for press releases. Phrases like, private struggles, difficult marriage, and domestic strain stared back at me. In their story, I was the villain. The reckless husband. The liability. And the $500,000? Hush money, disguised as payment for the contract I thought was transactional. A payoff to make me disappear quietly when the time came. My hands were shaking when I heard her voice behind me. Looking for something? I turned. She was standing at the doorway, calm, composed, the kind of calm that's scarier than anger. You planned all of it, I said, voice barely steady. The marriage, the payout, the lies. She didn't even deny it. You were convenient, she said simply. I needed stability. You needed money. It was mutually beneficial. Mutually. I laughed bitterly. You're framing me as unstable in your corporate filings, Victoria. You're calling me abusive. Her eyes flickered, a small crack, quickly sealed. That's just legal positioning. Nothing personal. Nothing personal, I repeated. You're destroying my life, but it's not personal. She stepped closer, expression unreadable. You're emotional, Ethan. That's why this wouldn't have worked long term. I told you from the beginning, this was business. You kissed me, I said quietly. You looked at me like. Like what? She interrupted, a faint smirk at the corner of her mouth. Like I cared. I stared at her, trying to find a trace of the woman who'd once fallen asleep beside me on the couch, the one who'd laughed at my stupid jokes at midnight. But she wasn't there. Only the Ice Queen, ruthless, efficient, untouchable. She reached past me and closed the laptop. Don't make the mistake of thinking I ever needed you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then she said it, the line that sealed everything. Try not to embarrass yourself. The press is unpredictable. We don't want to make this uglier than it needs to be. And just like that, she walked away. 2 weeks later, the headlines hit. CEO Victoria Hale files for divorce, cites unstable behavior from husband. Anonymous sources reveal emotional volatility behind closed doors. Hale Industries merger unaffected by personal turmoil, says spokesperson. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Colleagues. Journalists. Former clients. Everyone asked for a comment I couldn't give. Her PR team moved fast, feeding the narrative. A few leaked statements, selective texts, photos cropped just right, enough to make me look like the bitter husband lashing out after losing his meal ticket. By the time I tried to defend myself, the damage was done. My contract work dried up. My email is filled with rejections. The company I'd been consulting for terminated my agreement due to reputational risk. Even my landlord asked me to leave when the paparazzi started hovering near the building. I called her once. Just once. She answered on the second ring. You need to stop contacting me, she said calmly. It's not good for either of us. I didn't do anything wrong, I said. You know that. That's irrelevant now, she replied. What matters is perception. And perception is reality in this business. Victoria. She hung up. I remember packing my things into a single suitcase. The apartment she'd leased for me was already being repossessed. My account balance stared back at me, that same $500,000 sitting there like blood money, money I couldn't even touch without feeling sick. Everywhere I went, people looked at me differently. I was the man who couldn't keep his temper. The man who'd ruined a perfect woman's career and gotten paid off to disappear. One night, sitting alone in a motel room that smelled like dust and bleach, I saw her face on the news, poised, flawless, explaining to a reporter that sometimes relationships fail despite our best intentions. I turned off the TV before the interview ended. The silence afterward was deafening. That was the night I broke. Not in a cinematic way. No shouting, no smashed mirrors. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that eats you from the inside. I thought about the version of me she'd created, angry, unstable, disposable. And the worst part? People believed it because it was easier than believing that the Ice Queen could be cruel. For days, I drifted. Slept in cheap motels. Stared at the city I used to help build and wondered how you rebuild yourself when your name is poison. But grief has an expiration date. Eventually, pain hardens into something else, something sharper. The moment came when I saw her again, on a business broadcast. The merger had gone through. Hale Industries stock had never been higher. She smiled for the cameras, polished and triumphant. And then she said, "Sometimes sacrifices are necessary to protect what you've built." That was when the last trace of hope died. Sacrifices. That's what I was to her. A piece on her board, moved and removed at will. I sat there staring at the screen, and something inside me shifted. The despair settled, replaced by a cold clarity I hadn't felt in months. She wanted me erased. Forgotten. A footnote in her success story. But I wasn't finished yet. I started making calls. Quiet ones. Old contacts. People who still owed me favors. The architecture world might have been small, but corruption, that was Victoria's playground. And playgrounds always have witnesses. While she sat on top of her empire, celebrating her victory, I started digging. I didn't want to destroy her out of spite. I wanted her to understand what it felt like to lose control. To watch everything she built start to fracture, the way she'd fractured me. And for the first time since our wedding day, I smiled. It wasn't happiness. It was for a purpose. It started with an email I wasn't supposed to see. Victoria had left her laptop open on the dining table, the screen still glowing. I'd gotten home late from a meeting she'd sent me to cover, one that, in hindsight, was meant to get me out of the building. The subject line read, "Merger Timeline plus Pre-Divorce Strategy." I wish I could say I didn't open it. That I respected her privacy. But by then, privacy was already a lie we'd been telling each other for months. The document was clinical, bullet points and projections. But buried halfway down, a section froze my blood. Post-merger dissolution plan. Initiate divorce proceedings Q3 to maintain narrative control. Justification, emotional incompatibility and professional instability on the spouse's part. Ensure documentation supports a pattern of verbal aggression, attorney drafting affidavits. Financial settlement already disbursed, see initial payment, $500,000. It felt like the floor vanished. Every gesture of kindness, every shared glance, all of it was choreography for this. I scrolled further, finding her lawyer's signature and a series of drafts for press releases. Phrases like, private struggles, difficult marriage, and domestic strain stared back at me. In their story, I was the villain. The reckless husband. The liability. And the $500,000? Hush money, disguised as payment for the contract I thought was transactional. A payoff to make me disappear quietly when the time came. My hands were shaking when I heard her voice behind me. Looking for something? I turned. She was standing at the doorway, calm, composed, the kind of calm that's scarier than anger. "You planned all of it," I said, voice barely steady. "The marriage, the payout, the lies." She didn't even deny it. "You were convenient," she said simply. "I needed stability. You needed money. It was mutually beneficial." Mutually? I laughed bitterly. "You're framing me as unstable in your corporate filings, Victoria. You're calling me abusive." Her eyes flickered, a small crack, quickly sealed. "That's just legal positioning. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," I repeated. "You're destroying my life, but it's not personal." She stepped closer, expression unreadable. You're emotional, Ethan. That's why this wouldn't have worked long term. I told you from the beginning, this was business. You kissed me, I said quietly. You looked at me like. Like what? She interrupted, a faint smirk at the corner of her mouth. Like I cared. I stared at her, trying to find a trace of the woman who'd once fallen asleep beside me on the couch, the one who'd laughed at my stupid jokes at midnight. But she wasn't there. Only the Ice Queen, ruthless, efficient, untouchable. She reached past me and closed the laptop. Don't make the mistake of thinking I ever needed you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then she said it, the line that sealed everything. Try not to embarrass yourself. The press is unpredictable. We don't want to make this uglier than it needs to be. And just like that, she walked away. 2 weeks later, the headlines hit. CEO Victoria Hale files for divorce, cites unstable behavior from husband. Anonymous sources reveal emotional volatility behind closed doors. Hale Industries merger unaffected by personal turmoil, says spokesperson. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Colleagues. Journalists. Former clients. Everyone asked for a comment I couldn't give. Her PR team moved fast, feeding the narrative. A few leaked statements, selective texts, photos cropped just right, enough to make me look like the bitter husband lashing out after losing his meal ticket. By the time I tried to defend myself, the damage was done. My contract work dried up. My email is filled with rejections. The company I'd been consulting for terminated my agreement due to reputational risk. Even my landlord asked me to leave when the paparazzi started hovering near the building. I called her once. Just once. She answered on the second ring. You need to stop contacting me, she said calmly. It's not good for either of us. I didn't do anything wrong, I said. You know that. That's irrelevant now, she replied. What matters is perception. And perception is reality in this business. Victoria. She hung up. I remember packing my things into a single suitcase. The apartment she'd leased for me was already being repossessed. My account balance stared back at me, that same $500,000 sitting there like blood money, money I couldn't even touch without feeling sick. Everywhere I went, people looked at me differently. I was the man who couldn't keep his temper. The man who'd ruined a perfect woman's career and gotten paid off to disappear. One night, sitting alone in a motel room that smelled like dust and bleach, I saw her face on the news, poised, flawless, explaining to a reporter that sometimes relationships fail despite our best intentions. I turned off the TV before the interview ended. The silence afterward was deafening. That was the night I broke. Not in a cinematic way. No shouting, no smashed mirrors. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that eats you from the inside. I thought about the version of me she'd created, angry, unstable, disposable. And the worst part? People believed it because it was easier than believing that the Ice Queen could be cruel. For days, I drifted. Slept in cheap motels. Stared at the city I used to help build and wondered how you rebuild yourself when your name is poison. But grief has an expiration date. Eventually, pain hardens into something else, something sharper. The moment came when I saw her again, on a business broadcast. The merger had gone through. Hale Industries stock had never been higher. She smiled for the cameras, polished and triumphant. And then she said, sometimes sacrifices are necessary to protect what you've built. That was when the last trace of hope died. Sacrifices. That's what I was to her. A piece on her board, moved and removed at will. I sat there staring at the screen, and something inside me shifted. The despair settled, replaced by a cold clarity I hadn't felt in months. She wanted me erased. Forgotten. A footnote in her success story. But I wasn't finished yet. I started making calls. Quiet ones. Old contacts. People who still owed me favors. The architecture world might have been small, but corruption, that was Victoria's playground. And playgrounds always have witnesses. While she sat on top of her empire, celebrating her victory, I started digging. I didn't want to destroy her out of spite. I wanted her to understand what it felt like to lose control. To watch everything she built start to fracture, the way she'd fractured me. And for the first time since our wedding day, I smiled. It wasn't happiness. It was for a purpose. The first thing I learned after I lost everything was how small I'd become in other people's eyes. Not literally, my shoulders didn't shrink, but my name fit into fewer sentences. Where gossip had been syrup thick before, it dwindled to a footnote. People who had once courted me for projects and introductions treated me like someone to be pitied, not someone to be reckoned with. That was useful. The second thing I learned was that you can disappear if you mean it. I took what remained of my dignity and $300 in cash and moved into a cheap studio in a part of the city where no one who mattered ever went. I changed the way I dressed, the way I answered calls. I let the world believe I was a cautionary tale the way museums keep corpses, in glass, out of reach. But I did not go quiet. I did small work, freelance renderings, odd consultations. Nothing impressive, nothing headline-worthy. Enough to keep food on the table and to pay for a burner phone. I worked odd hours. I made friends with baristas and building managers. I learned the rhythm of a life that belonged to nobody important. It sharpened me. It taught me patience, and patience is the currency of people who plot. Most importantly, I listened. You can hear a lot when you're no longer inside the echo chamber of a boardroom. People complain. People brag. People leave pieces of themselves on voicemail. I started running my ears along the seams of Victoria's world. I spent late afternoons in cafes near Hale Industries. I sat where delivery drivers waited and asked the right small questions. Who's moving in and out of the building? Which vendors have suddenly changed terms? Where do the corporate checks get routed? Pieces accumulated. A payment here. A name there. Nothing explosive on its own, but patterns emerged, like cracks forming in concrete. I learned too that corporations are sanctuaries of secrets. They are also houses of paper. Contracts, memos, amended agreements, so many redundancies you can drown in them. And where there are redundancies, there are lies. If someone was hiding a fraud, they would hide it in the noise. They would make sure every irregularity looked like protocol. One night, months into my quiet, I was sketching a facade for a client when my burner rang. It was an unknown number. The voice was guarded, almost conspiratorial. "You Ethan Cole?" the caller asked. "Yes. You used to work at Tully and Moore, right? With the project on 5th? That was me," I admitted, wary. There was a pause, the sound of a cup being set down. "I can help you get back in," the voice said. "But it'll cost you something else, information, access. Are you still around?" I had spent weeks cultivating small alliances like this. I didn't rush. "Where are you calling from?" I asked. "From inside Hale," he said. "Assistant." The name was given in a whisper, a detail, but a golden one. "My name's Aaron. I don't like what they've been doing. I'm not talking to anyone officially. I'm talking to you. I didn't meet people like Aaron by accident. I'd been watching the assistants, the interns. They move through the building like shadows, carrying both coffee and secrets. They hear things, they see attachments on desks, they make mistakes. Aaron had been overpriced at the company's holiday party, a quiet kid who staggered under the weight of a too expensive tie. He had a bored, resentful look in his eyes. He was exactly the kind of person who becomes inconvenient when he notices the wrong thing. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you were close enough to know how to read a ledger," he said. "And because you were on the inside. People still talk about that. I want someone who knows the language. Also, you don't have much to lose, do you? I smiled without meaning to. No. Not anymore. We met in an empty parking garage. He slid me a memory stick, awkward, plastic, cheap. Just a taste, he said. There's more where that came from. Inside were documents, internal memos, attachments, email chains with subject lines about window dressing and offshore buffers. The spreadsheets were color-coded and dirty in a way that suggested they'd been hammered into shape by someone who thought accounting was a suggestion. Big numbers were moved into small accounts and then laundered through shell purchases, fake labor, bogus permits, consulting fees, to companies that existed only on paper. It wasn't just questionable bookkeeping. It was the architecture of fraud. The kind that props up valuations, that props up merger prices, that makes shareholders nod like hypnotized men. And Victoria was at the center. Or at least her fingerprints were all over the blueprint. I remember sitting in the car for a long time, the city a blur beyond the windshield. I read and reread those files until the letters stopped swimming. The rage I'd felt after the divorce roared back, hot and focused. This was bigger than me now. This was poison that would spill onto everybody who'd trusted her, who'd invested in the skyline she built. That made it a matter of decency. Something like moral clarity if you squinted at it from the right angle. That's how I convinced myself I wasn't just getting even. From there, planning became choreography. I wasn't a saboteur in the literal sense, I didn't want to blow up servers or break into safes. I wanted something cleaner, surgical. I wanted the exposure to come from sources that couldn't be accused of vindictiveness. I wanted evidence. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the truth laid out so plainly that her PR team couldn't spin it into martyrdom. Which meant I needed allies inside the building who could be trusted not to sell out. Aaron was the start. He introduced me to Sophie, an analyst in compliance who'd been passed over for promotion one too many times. She had the sort of quiet fury that's perfect for doing other people's dirty work without telling anyone. She had access to folders that were labeled in jargon and ignored for convenience. I bribed, I begged, I offered credibility where needed. I lent my expertise in reading corporate documents in exchange for access. I fixed a layout for an analyst presentation, I rewired an audit spreadsheet, I rendered a facade in charcoal and handed it over like I was doing charity work. The favors added up. Small debts pile into larger ones, and people become invested in the outcome because they've already paid for it with time. Emotionally, this phase was brutal. Part of me wanted to confront Victoria in a showdown, to throw her words back at her and watch the ice crack in real time. Part of me still missed the woman who'd once confided about birthdays and business with an honesty she rarely allowed. There were late nights when I'd sit at my cheap table and wonder if someplace inside her, under all that calcified defense, she'd ever been someone who could love. Mostly, the pain won. Every time I let myself imagine the woman beneath the ice, a memory surfaced where she'd said, with a surgical calm, "You were convenient." Convenience is not affection. Convenience is a ledger entry. The ledger does not heal. The ledger makes you invisible. So I kept my distance. I kept the focus. I refined the plan until it was not vengeance but architecture, a blueprint for collapse. Step 1, corroboration. I had the memos, but memos can be explained away as drafts. I needed signed affidavits, or at least corroborating emails with timestamps, from people who'd witnessed transactions. Sophie dug through audit trails. Aaron eavesdropped and photographed. I called old clients who had been offered suspicious contracts, a construction supplier remembered checks that were cleared to a shell company. Bits of testimony clicked into place like teeth in a jaw. Step 2, containment. I made anonymous tips to 2 journalists I'd met briefly years ago. I didn't flood their inboxes. I fed them enough to pique curiosity, an offhand detail here, a suspicious payment there. Journalists are animals that smell blood in the water, they started asking questions, quietly, at first. The trick was to be invisible enough that the source could not be traced back to me, but persistent enough that curiosity turned into investigation. Step 3, Timing. A scandal has to have cadence. Too fast and it looks like a smear. Too slow and it dies. I synchronized leaks with fiscal reports and press conferences. I made sure that every time Victoria stood before a camera to declare stability, a new, inconvenient data point appeared that contradicted her narrative. A supposed cost center would suddenly look like a laundering funnel. A vendor during a press Q&A would be shown to be a company with no employees. Step 4, Moral Pressure. I reached out to a few board members anonymously with documentation and carefully framed the risks. People who cling to power do so because they are afraid of losing it more than they are proud of keeping it. Presenting them with the cold arithmetic of how much they stood to lose, and how deeply implicated they were, turned allies into skeptics overnight. If the board looked at the math and saw fingers pointing at their own ledgers, internal fractures would appear. Power loves symmetry, even the guilty turn on each other. All the while, I kept my face placid in public. I returned to client meetings with a new edge, no desperation, only competence. A few people who had been wary began to take me seriously again. Reputation is strange, fall down spectacularly and people remember, crawl back with measured success and they start to listen. Then, as the plan matured, Victoria began to show the first signs of unraveling. She was always controlled, control was a weapon and refuge. But control requires perfect information, and I was slowly thinning hers. She stopped sleeping well, someone told me she drank earlier in the evening. Her schedule began to have gaps where meetings used to be. There were whispered fights in the boardroom. An assistant saw her slam a door so hard an intern flinched. In one public interview she smiled too widely and then immediately wiped the smile away, it looked like a seam being forced closed. She reached out to me then, in a way that made my throat close. "Ethan," she said, the words soft over the phone. "We need to talk." There was a vulnerability under that thin veneer, less an apology than a recognition of shared history. I could have answered her honestly, could have told her what I knew, could have given her a single chance to step back from the ledge. The woman I almost loved might have done the same for me. Instead, I did what I had to do. "I'll meet you," I said. My voice was steady. "Tomorrow. 12. The cafe on Mercer." I would play the sympathetic ex-husband. I would let her think I might help. I would let her beg for what she thought I still had to give, protection. Meanwhile, the plan I'd spent months building, affidavits, corroborations, journalists primed, board members ready, would move to the final phase. The difference between planning and execution is composure. I had learned to be patient. I had learned to let the ice break on its own. When a glacier shifts, it takes its own sweet time, and when it falls, the sound is catastrophic. Tomorrow would be the last gentle gesture I allowed her before the avalanche I'd orchestrated finished its path. I told myself I was doing this for justice. I told myself I was giving her the only lesson she understood: power is not impenetrable. Mostly, I told myself so I wouldn't hear the small, traitorous voice that still wondered what might have been if a different life had made us different people. That voice would whisper in the margins of my evenings, a ghost that didn't deserve the light. When I hung up from her call, the city was a smear beyond the cafe window. People moved small, urgent lives. I sipped my coffee cold and checked my notes one last time. The trap was not elegant. It was surgical. It had no poetry. But it would be precise. And precision, I'd learned, has its own cruelty. The annual gala at the Hale Tower Ballroom was always more theater than celebration, chandeliers the size of small planets, a string quartet tuned to perfection, linen that cost more than my first apartment. Tonight, the room hummed with the kind of self-satisfaction that comes from believing yourself untouchable. Investors smiled like sunlit marble. Board members swapped toasts as if they were immortals. Victoria moved through them like a queen through her court, flawless, rehearsed, the picture they'd all bought into. I had a place at a table near the back. I could have sat anywhere. I chose the one that gave me a view of the dais and the press pit, where cameras waited like patient predators. I wore the same ring on my hand I'd worn the day we signed the papers, a small, stupid thing that had once meant nothing and had later been paid for with $500,000. It fit like a scar. The evening began as expected: speeches, a slideshow of completed projects, a cinematic reveal of a new tower with Victoria's name lit across the render in gold. She took the stage to applause, her voice smooth as cut glass. Investors clinked their glasses. The cameras loved her. That was the moment the plan I'd built in cheap coffee shops and whispered meetings with disgruntled assistants started to move. A projector light flicked, and instead of the glossy render the audience expected, the screen filled with a document, time-stamped emails, an internal memo with Victoria's signature, invoice numbers that led to shell companies. At first the room thought it was part of the presentation, another triumph of design. Then the scrolling stopped. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Confirmed, evidence of financial misrepresentation in Hale-Lexford merger." A murmur rippled and grew teeth. Phones lifted. Heads turned. Victoria's smile faltered for the smallest fraction of a second, that is all it takes. On the stage, her PR chief moved like a shadow, shushing the orchestra. Victoria blinked, then made a show of composure. "There appears to be a technical issue," she said, voice even. "We will resume shortly." It was the rehearsed line, it was exactly what she had trained them to say. But the projector kept rolling. More documents appeared, spreadsheets with wire trails, notarized affidavits from vendors who said they'd never performed work they'd been paid for, time-stamped emails showing approvals that never existed. One by one, every carefully arranged facade she'd built on paper was displayed in high definition for the very people who had given it value. From the press pit, a reporter I'd tipped, one who had spent months following the breadcrumbs I fed him, stood up and asked the question she could not rehearse her way out of. "Ms. Hale, are these documents authentic? Did you authorize these transfers?" A thin, practiced laugh escaped her. "This is a smear attempt," she said. "We are cooperating with an internal audit." A voice from a table near mine called out, "We're board members. We deserve a straight answer." The murmuring turned to a low roar. I watched the board's faces change, the little muscle twitches, the eyes that suddenly measured risk instead of loyalty. The math on the screen began to speak louder than any speech. People who had counted on the stock's trajectory saw paper-thin support beams start to crumble. Her lawyer mouthed something fiercely at her, but the law is slow and tonight the court of public opinion moved faster. Camera lights brightened, phones streamed live. Comments and hashtags started to appear on screens like a tide. Victoria's veneer fractured in a way I'd only seen in private. A flash of panic under her composure, then a mask again. She stepped down from the stage and walked into the crowd toward the press pit, each step precise. I could see her searching faces. She found mine. For a second, time compressed. The noise around us became oceanic, and we were a small island. She looked at me like someone scanning a ledger for a missing line, desperate, calculating, and for the first time since the divorce, a little human. "Ethan," she said, low enough that the microphones didn't catch it. Her voice was a fissure trying to close. "What is this?" I let the applause wash over us, turned my ring, and felt its weight. "You taught me power, Victoria," I said, and the word surprised me by being calm. "I just learned how to use it." Her eyes narrowed, then widened as realization slid across her face. She tried to form a reply, a legalistic dismissal, a command to her security, but the ballroom had shifted. Board members were standing, not because she asked, but because the logic of loss had suddenly become their most immediate calculus. A man I'd seen smirk at her days ago was on his phone, his jaw tight. "We need an emergency session," he hissed. The press swarmed. Questions hit her like hail. Her PR team scrambled, hands flapping, faces pale. Someone had called the auditors, someone had texted a regulator. I watched as the people who had once smiled at her now measured distance. The ring on my finger felt cold as a witness. She grabbed my arm. For a second the old cadence of our life tried to reassert itself, a private touch in public to anchor her. "Ethan," she whispered, trembling in the word. "Please. Help me. Tell them. Tell them the truth," I said. "You don't get to ask me to save a life you helped sink." Her face broke then, not into controlled composure but into something raw and thin and human. The Ice Queen melted in a way I had never intended to savor, yet could not look away from. Her hands shook. A reporter approached, voice urgent. A board member demanded an explanation. Her breath came small and quick. The cameras were unrelenting. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the story, she was the story. She tried to reclaim it with a statement, thin, evasive, but the documents were already viral. The auditors would have their subpoenas in the morning. The stock ticker began to slip, whispers of emergency meetings turned into orders. I stepped back as her world constricted. I did not gloat. I did not dance. There is no joy in watching someone you once thought you might love dissolve. What I felt was something else, a quiet closure that had nothing to do with victory or vengeance. It felt like settling a debt with myself. She found my eyes one last time. There was pleading there, and a small, humiliating recognition. "You were supposed to be loyal," she said, voice raw. "You were supposed to. You paid me to be convenient," I finished for her. "You wanted a performance. You didn't want a person." Her knees seemed to give a fraction. A security official led her toward a private room where she could speak to lawyers off camera. The room swallowed her up like a mouth. I walked out into the cold air beyond the ballroom doors and felt the city breathe around me. The glass tower loomed behind like a fossilized ambition. Inside, she would spend the next hours conducting damage control, denying, spinning, bargaining. The board would convene. The press would feast. Legal teams would circle. Her empire, which had always been built on impeccable lines and elegant deception, would now be subjected to patient, intrusive measurement. People would call me brave or petty. They might never know the months of small, careful work, the allies recruited, the ethical calculus that bent towards something like justice. They might call me by other names, ones I'd heard before. It did not matter. I slid my hand into my pocket and felt the ring, the same loop of metal that had once been a prop in her narrative. It was mine now, if only as a reminder that things with price tags can be reclaimed and redefined. Behind me, the ballroom filled with noise and the sound of a life unthreading. I walked away because some endings require distance to be clean. I walked away because the emptiness she'd given me was best returned, whole and undeniable. When I reached the street, the night sounded ordinary, cars, late conversations, the distant hiss of a city that kept making and losing everything. I didn't look back. I didn't need to watch the final curtain fall. She had wanted stability. She had wanted a prop. Tonight, she'd gotten something else, exposure, vulnerability, the kind of solitude that success couldn't fill. As I melted into the crowd, my chest was a strange, quiet place. Not satisfied. Not healed. But done. It's been a year since the gala. Sometimes, I still see her name scroll across the news ticker, former Hale Industries CEO faces trial over corporate misconduct. Her photo always looks the same, precise, polished, chin tilted like she's still measuring the angle of her own power. I don't think she realizes yet that power doesn't photograph well once it's gone. I live somewhere quieter now. The kind of place where people don't ask what you used to do, only what you can build. I design homes for people who'll never know my name. I wake up early, make my own coffee, and keep the blinds half open. The light feels different when no one owns it. Sometimes, when I'm drafting, I catch myself thinking of her, not the scandal, not the betrayal, but the moments between. The wine nights. The accidental warmth in her voice when she forgot to be invincible. It's strange how the mind preserves even the frost in crystal clarity. But I don't feel anger anymore. Just a quiet understanding of what we both were. She wanted control so badly she mistook it for love. I wanted stability so badly I mistook her control for care. Maybe that's the cruelest symmetry of it all, we both used each other, just for different currencies. The press says she's cooperating now, trading information for leniency. They say she's living in a penthouse still, though smaller, stripped of art and meaning. The Ice Queen is still in her castle, but without the crown. And me? I walk by the ocean most mornings, no ring, no headlines, no debts. Just blue water and clean air. I think about how much she paid to keep the world believing in her story, and how little it cost to dismantle it. Some nights, I imagine what I'd say if we ever met again. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe just the truth she always tried to buy but never learned to hold. That control isn't love. It's fear, disguised as certainty. She taught me how to live without love, I just taught her what that really feels like.